Thank you very much, Eve. So without further ado, that's enough of me talking. I'm going to be introducing you this afternoon to Terry Bauer and Gareth Dimlow, the co-founders of Inside Stories, a Brighton-based company. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. So the co-founders, who have 25 years of experience in creative storytelling for strategy, sales and marketing and digital media marketing within various industries, including events and tech. They gave up their corporate lives and wanted to offer the essential but almost forgotten art of craftful, meaningful, memorable and moving business stories for their customers. So working with those businesses at critical pinch points in their respective business lifespans, words like purpose and story get thrown around all too easily, but actually uncovering those, I think, requires an altogether different approach. So Inside Stories is a new kind of marketing and communications company. There's no agency fees, no one-size-fits-all campaigns, and no crippling overheads. I'm not going to go into too much detail, more detail about the company, because I'll leave that up to Gareth this afternoon, but we're set for an action-packed session. So I hope that you all take real value from this afternoon's session and enjoy hearing from the duo. We'll be circulating information and contact details after this. And if you haven't already checked out the Inside Stories website, I would definitely recommend doing so. It's brilliant, really informative, and I enjoyed the read. So go away and have a look at that afterwards. So Gareth, I'm going to hand over to you. I'd like to say thank you to you both so much for giving your time this afternoon. We really appreciate it, and I'm sure the over 100 strong audience do as well. So a huge thank you from us, and yeah, really looking forward to hearing your session this afternoon.
Thanks, John.
Thanks very much, Charlie. It's a little bit intimidating to know that you're the last speaker on a really packed agenda full of great speakers, because it does mean that expectations are high. And the promise of an action-packed session, I hope no one's going to be disappointed if I'm not fired out of a cannon sometime in the next hour. But I'll try and keep your attention, if nothing else. And I am going to share my presentation, so you've got the slides to look at rather than me in yet another floral shirt, because that's the other problem as well. When you've got a profile picture in a loud shirt, you have to be careful that you never repeat the same shirt again. Otherwise, people just think you've only got one look when you walk into the room. So as I said, I'm going to share my screen and I'll just run through the introductions so you know who I am and what we do. As Charlie said in her introduction, we're called Inside Stories because we just felt that in terms of particularly small and medium-sized businesses, they're massively underserved by the kind of capabilities that they really need. There are lots of people out there who can sell you stuff, but very few businesses that really take the time to understand where you're at, where you're going, and how you might possibly get there. And certainly from my background, which was a combination of being a creative director in agencies and then moving into a strategic role in 2 other big agencies, the one thing that really connected all of those things was understanding the power of a story, not just to communicate what's going on, but to help people understand what we need them to do with that information. And so over the next 60 minutes, I'm going to talk through why we think storytelling is important. I'm going to try and give you some pointers and some tips that'll help you understand how you can apply some of this knowledge. And if nothing else, I think it'll maybe get you just thinking differently about how you communicate about your own business. Today is not a selling session, so there will be no handy references to case studies or work we've done with other clients. This is simply a chance for us to give you the benefit of some of our experience and our points of view. If you want to get in touch afterwards, my colleague Terry is the person to get to know. He's the meter, greeter, networker and connector, and between us we figure 2 is plenty for building a great business. So let me jump straight in. And I want to start by telling a story, just to get everyone settled, used to the sound of my voice, and also just demonstrate the power of what a story can do to an audience. So I'd like you to think about the Second World War. I'd like you to think about the Allied forces battling Germany in its gradual expansion across Europe. Something really interesting happened during the Second World War as the US Air Force joined the Allied efforts. What they found was they were losing an awful lot of their squadrons, much like the UK. And this story resonates with me because my grandfather was actually a pilot in the Second World War. He was a Lancaster pilot. And when I heard this story, it really resonated. The US Air Force were losing planes over Germany. They were participating in bombing raids. They were having successful missions and flying back. And what the German Air Force often used to do, their Messerschmitts would sit above the clouds. They'd swoop down, appearing out of nowhere, shooting the Air Force, and they lost planes. And obviously there was a tremendous human casualty, but also the actual assets themselves, they were losing the planes. So the US Air Force strategic team decided that they needed to come up with a solution to safeguard their pilots and their squadrons to strengthen the war effort. And what they came up with was an idea that as the planes returned back to base, they could study where those Messerschmitt bullet hits had occurred, and they could therefore identify where the planes required reinforcement. And you can Google this, this is a true story. They developed these designs that showed the planes where the bullet hits had landed on the planes. And as you can see from this diagram, there were clear concentrations of bullets. Obviously, a lot of them shot from above. And they figured that if they looked at where all these bullets had hit, they could reinforce those parts of the planes, safeguard their squadron, and have more successful missions. But there was one scientist in the team, his name was Vold, and he saw things differently. And he said, look, guys, this is great, and I'm not telling you you're wrong, but there's one flaw in what we're proposing here. And they said, well, what is it? Tell us, don't keep us in suspense. He said, here we're studying the planes that made it back. What we need to do is think about all the planes that didn't make it back. Because I would propose that the ones who didn't make it back took bullets in the areas where we don't see any bullet hits here. And as he pointed at the diagram, what they could see was the end of the tail, the cockpit, the two main propellers, the midpoints of the wing. And it made perfect sense suddenly that they were studying the wrong thing. That transformed their approach to reinforcing the planes and proved to be enormously successful. It actually triggered a whole separate movement that's all around survivorship bias, which is a psychological phenomenon. But what I find interesting about that story, apart from the fact that it's got a great mic drop moment in it, is it says to me that often the story, the thing that's really compelling, that changes everything, is staring us in plain sight, but it's not where the details tend to appear. So oftentimes it's the space in between those details where the real story exists. And we're often drawn to the things that look like evidence as in that's where we need to build our story. I like to think of it slightly differently. As I said, that was just a story to get you warmed up about the power of stories. Now let's jump into today's presentation. So, we live in a world of content, and there will be some of you who will probably look at this and think this is rather controversial because I'm just showing a skip full of rubble. But we've got a point of view in Inside Stories that content has become something of a meaningless word over the last 20 years. We didn't used to talk about content. We used to talk about stories. We used to talk about communication. We used to talk about narratives. But we now live in a world where content is a product, is an output that we're all generating constantly. And there are lots of people who've mistaken the role that content plays in our lives. I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, so I won't labor this point, but suffice it to say, I just want you to store in your mind the word content and what it means to you. Because as Charlie said in the setup to today's session, the mission for all of us, the objective for all of us, and I imagine the reason you're all here today listening to this presentation, is As businesses, we all have a challenge, and that's to stand out. We're in a crowded marketplace. So how do we find the thing that isn't just going to capture people's attention, but it's going to trigger their imagination? And more importantly, it's going to make them want to work with us. Because one thing's for sure, when you're a small or medium-sized enterprise, you can't always outspend the competition. So there will always be bigger, badder players out there in the marketplace, in your sector, in your space, who can just outspend you. They've got more financing, or they've got big investors, or they've just got a scale that you don't have. So the old ideas of you can just outspend them on the marketing front doesn't really work when you've got a finite amount of resources and a finite sized team too. So what do? How do we go about capturing audience attention? And the key thing here is not capture, which to me sounds almost threatening. It's audience. So much of what we do and what we talk about with our clients every day is seeing the world through your audience's eyes. And whether you call them a client or a customer doesn't really matter. They're your audience, and you've got to start understanding how they perceive you rather than what you want to tell them. And we're going to come back to this point a couple of times over the next half an hour or so. There is another challenge here, and it's largely to do with the fact that we're still living with the hangover of the dawn of the advertising age. So this principle of uniqueness, the idea that everybody needs a USP, is often a bit of a bum steer. It gives people a sense that they should be prioritizing the wrong thing. And those of you who've watched Mad Men, if you haven't, I do recommend it. I think it's on Prime if you want to catch up. There's 7 seasons. It's very gripping. It's a really interesting social history as well as a great drama, but it's about the ad industry, and it captures that point of time in the 1960s where the ad industry really became the tastemakers, the change makers of society. They didn't just sell dishwashing fluid and detergent and cheese. They were changing the way people perceived the world around them. And at that time, it was very easy, if you made a product or you sold a service, to identify a unique selling point. And that's why you'll hear, if you speak to any marketing or branding professionals, they'll still be telling you about the importance of the USP. And I'm not saying it's not important. However, lesson number 1 from today's talk is the fact that the USP is sometimes the wrong thing to fixate on. In the 1960s, where you often only had 1 or 2 products or brands in a particular category, we now have a proliferation in every category. We all have countless competitors in our respective spaces. And the challenge of thinking about something that's truly unique is, as I said, it's a bum steer. It's sometimes not the thing to fixate on, because that uniqueness is often really hard to quantify. So I would argue that the unique selling point isn't what really matters. And from your customer's point of view, what they need from you is more than just a logo or a smart looking website. That's the destination where they'll find out more information. The challenge that we have and the opportunity that's presented by having a really great coherent story is the thing that drives them to that website. So one of the things we often find ourselves talking a lot about is SEO, because there's a whole industry that's sprung up in the last 15 years or so around search engine optimization. And it can often confuse a lot of people who are procuring marketing services for the first time. They're not from that world. They don't really know how it works. And people who do understand that world can swoop in and go, look, we can sort out the SEO, we can make it work for you, and we can ensure that you're ranking much higher on those all-important Google searches. And that's a super valuable service. However, the one flaw in that concept is if the story that they find when they arrive at their destination isn't matching their expectations or isn't solving a need for them, then all of the SEO in the world isn't really going to accomplish anything, because it's simply driving people to an amazing destination that's still under construction, that isn't yet going to be able to fulfill those promises that you're making. So what we need to do is effectively develop both in conjunction, where you're refining the story that quantifies what you're all about as a business in a way that resonates with your target audience. And then the SEO helps trigger those responses by using the words that underline the story that we're telling. Because when your customers think about what they want from you, they don't just want a product. This is something that used to come across a lot in my old agency life, where we'd often be invited to pitch for a piece of work, and we'd be on a roster with 7 or 8 of our competitors. And just for reference, that means 7 or 8 big agencies spending up to £50,000 on a pitch to win a piece of business. It's great for the one agency that wins that piece of work, but for the other 7, that's £50,000 that they've spent to get precisely nowhere. And so you spend a lot of time thinking about what's going to make the difference, what's going to make the client remember you and feel that you've given them something truly important. And it's so much more than just the pure capability, because, as I always used to say, we wouldn't be on the roster if we couldn't do the job. So the thing that we know how to do is a given. That's not where our story lies. But the things that those clients are looking for and the things that your clients are looking for aren't what your product does. They're looking for things like your values, your mission, your vision, the attitude that you bring to bear when you work with them. But the problem is, you can't just go, well, here's our brand guidelines, have a read through those, you'll probably understand what we're about, and then you want to work with us. The story is a way of communicating all of these things all wrapped up in one bundle, so that they don't ever feel like they're learning about you. You're simply taking them on a journey using a well-crafted narrative. And this is more important than ever. You know, I'm delighted to see so many people here today, because that means you've all weathered the last 12 months. And we all know, as you know, small business owners, small, medium-sized business owners, this has been a tough year. We've all had to find new ways of adapting to a bunch of unprecedented changes that 2 years ago, none of us could ever have predicted. But here's the interesting thing, and you'll get this as we go through my presentation. I'm kind of an optimistic person. I'm a very positive person. And one of the things that I believe firmly as an outcome of the last 12 months is that we as a species are better at dealing with change than we give ourselves credit for. We're so used to going, oh, I don't like change, I fear change, I don't like uncertainty. The fact is, we don't get a say in the matter. Change happens whether we like it or not. But what I'm so happy to see is how many businesses have been able to adjust and adapt and reconfigure themselves, reshaping and resizing, rolling with the punches, and recognizing that the thing that they're all about is the thing that really matters. There was a great example that Dave Trott shared on his blog a few weeks ago that really resonated on this level, where he was talking about gym brands. And he said, the interesting thing about this whole COVID experience is there are 2 kinds of gym brands, the ones who are succeeding and the ones who are going under. And what he explained was the ones who are succeeding are the ones that recognize that as a brand, they're not about a space where people go to do exercises. They're about motivation. They're about encouragement. They're about support and education and supplementary information. The brands that think as a gym that they just offer up a space where people can come and do sit-ups and lift weights, they're the ones who are going under, because they are too rooted in the idea that they are just one thing. So great example in Dave Trott's blog there of just how easy it is to take a step back and understand what you're really about as a business and weather the most incredible storms. And so what we're talking about here today is how we go about building that narrative, because I keep using the word story. And I think for a lot of people, the notion of a business story is almost incongruous, because business is, you know, that horrible old saying, it's not personal, it's just business. This idea that we depersonalize our business processes because we need to sound like professionals, whereas story seems to trigger all of those heartfelt emotional moments. My point of view is those 2 are inextricably linked, and you separate them at your peril. And we're going to talk about a little bit about how that happens. If we all think back to our first experience of stories, I imagine for the majority of us, it was bedtime. And one of our parents or caregivers would come in and read us a story. And we loved it because as children, we know that bedtime stories mean another 20 minutes till the light goes off. Perfect. but to the parents, it's just as important. It's the reason that those parents who work long hours away from home are really insistent on racing home to get there. If they miss bath time, they at least need to be there for story time. And the reason is, it's not because they want to read that Peppa Pig book for 140th time. It's because they understand that the power of telling a story is a way that you forge a lasting connection with another human being. And so story time for parents and kids are as important for the parent as they are for the child. We need to remember that mindset when it comes to the stories that we tell on behalf of our businesses. And once you've got your story right, there is no limit to what it can do for your business. So whether you're developing a new marketing strategy, whether you're thinking about how you're going to engage a PR professional, someone to manage your digital, build your website, run your social media account, whether you're negotiating with suppliers and third-party providers of supplementary products and services, whether you're trying to get new investors on board, or whether you're bringing new employees into the business as you continue to grow successfully. The story is at the heart of all of that. And it's super important to remember, again, that the story is not what's our ad campaign. The story is about who we are as a business and where we're going together. And the fact is, this is hardwired into us as human beings. If you travel all the way back through time, back before the printed press, the written word, the hieroglyphics, back before anything was written down, oral storytelling was the only way that people were able to impart information to one another. It happened from generation to generation, village elders sitting around fires, telling people what they understood of the world. And the amazing thing about the stories was they often expanded to fill in the gaps left by a lack of scientific knowledge. So all the way back in the origins of our species, where we didn't understand how anything worked, we didn't understand why rain fell from the sky or where the moon came from every time it went dark. So we invented stories to explain those things. And that's because there's an actual biological imperative inside all of us about how our brains respond to stories. As I said, it's hardwired into all of us. So even if you're someone who is resistant to the florid narrative notion of what a story is, you cannot deny that your brain responds a certain way. It's always funny whenever we work with clients who have any kind of a scientific background. I have to apologize for this slide because I call it science, but true scientists often sort of make a gagging sound when they see this because it's really bad science, but it is true. Here is my very specific scientific diagram of the brain. And here's what happens to the brain when it hears a story. The first thing that happens is the listener, the neural coupling in the listener's brain allows them to connect the story that they're hearing to their own ideas and experience. So they find relevance in what they're being told and they connect it to the way they perceive the world around them. Then what happens is dopamine's released. And this is what happens in our body every time we have any kind of an emotional experience. And basically dopamine feels good. We all enjoy that feeling because the emotional trigger releases that chemical into our system and we experience a changed state. And then the third thing that happens is mirroring. Anyone who's ever done, sales training will understand the importance of mirroring and matching because it's how you demonstrate empathy and forge a human connection with another human being by reflecting back some of their own experiences. So it's all about making a connection. So those are the three things that are going on subconsciously when someone tells us a story. And then one other thing happens is the cortex activity, which is where we actually process the facts. So for all of us, we've got all of these emotional things that are going on that are telling us the data, the detail, the information, but we don't process that until the neural coupling, the dopamine and the mirroring have taken place. So we actually use the facts to rationalize what we already feel. But if you think about what happens traditionally in any form of B2B communications, the instinct is naturally to lead with facts. Think about people who, pull together a proposal for an investor. It's so often led by, the balance sheet. What are the numbers? What we don't do is take the time to think about these human brain reactions to it. We just try and lead with the facts. But I said that was horrible and embarrassing science. I like mnemonics. I like things that are easy to remember. And Charlie referenced this in the intro to today's presentation. What we did was we decided if we were going to own the principles of storytelling, the first thing we needed to do is define what we mean by a story. And by that, I'm not talking about the thing that we all learned in school about how to write an essay, where you tell them what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. That's just simple structure. This is more about how do you run a slide rule over whatever you're doing and make sure that you're telling a story rather than just delivering some information. And the way you do it, to go back to that brain diagram, is you make sure that it's meaningful, memorable, and moving. So if it's meaningful, it's resonating. It feels authentic and true. If it's memorable, it means there's some sort of a hook in there. There's something that everybody will remember. I don't know what today's presentation will mean to you all, but I'd like to think that there will be some part of what I've talked about today that you'll go away and it will be the one thing you'll think of when you listen to this presentation. Maybe it'll be that story about the US Air Force. I don't know. We'll see. I might ask you later. Finally, it's got to be moving. You've got to be mindful of creating an emotional state change in whoever you're communicating with. And if you do those three things, you're telling a story. It doesn't matter if it's a long story like Stephen King's The Stand, which I just reread recently. It's about 1,400 pages. Or if it's like Ernest Hemingway, who famously wrote the world's most tragic short story in 6 words, which just read, "Baby shoes for sale, never worn." That's the power of a story, is that you can take people on that emotional journey with the absolute bare minimum of words. So I want to give you all a challenge. We are now at the halfway point of this presentation. So I'm going to ask you to think about what we've discussed so far and reflect it back on your own respective businesses. So I'm going to set you a challenge with 3 key questions to think about that relate to what I've just discussed in terms of how we codify a story. And what I'd like you to do, obviously, I'd like you to continue listening to the rest of the presentation, but I'd also like you to be thinking about this. And obviously, the rest of the team that we've got here will be monitoring what you put in the chat box. But I'd like you to share with us the answers to these 3 questions under the heading of your business. So the first one, what do you mean to your customers? And the important distinction here is this is all about that authenticity, that what resonates, what's meaningful. What do you mean to them is not what do you do, what do you make, what do you sell? What do you mean to them? What is the cut through that feels authentic and powerful when you build a successful relationship with your customer base? The second question, what makes you memorable to others? So imagine that you had 5 minutes to talk to someone about your business, about what you do, why you set up the business. What's the one thing that you'd like them to remember? Just one thing. And finally, you probably predicted where this was going if you remembered the meaningful, memorable, moving. But what emotion do you inspire in people? And it could be anything. And, you know, one of the things you learn early on in the advertising industry is to stay away from negative emotions because people don't like them. But to be honest, that's misrepresenting how emotions work. And you can think about all of those, you know, security companies and life insurance companies and alarm system companies that all use things like fear and anxiety and upset in order to build their business and their brand. So there's no bad answer to this question, but it is important to think about the emotions that you want to trigger. So 3 simple questions. What do you mean to your customers? What do you want them to remember about you? And what emotions do you inspire? As I said, we've only got really an hour today, so we can't build your business or your brand from the ground up. But what we can do is start the journey of thinking about those key questions. So allow those to just roll around in your brain as we continue through the presentation, and then we'll see where you got to at the end. So I said earlier that content is a bit of a challenging word for us in Inside Stories. And the interesting thing is every time we get the opportunity to talk to lovely people like yourselves, we often drop the bomb that content is our C word, and everyone sort of looks rather shocked and offended. And we explain, no, it's fine. Content is the C word for our business. And they seem a little bit upset, and sometimes they feel directly challenged because they are often content producers themselves. But as I said at the start, we've lost the meaning of the word content. And here's the problem with the word content. As a word, it literally means stuff that goes inside an empty thing, right? So whether you're a half full or half empty person, when you look at this glass of water, the water is just content. It wouldn't matter if that was beer or sour milk or yogurt or sand. The fact is, it's just content if its only job is to fill up an empty space. And what's interesting, particularly in the events industry, which Terry, my business partner, and I both came from, is content has proliferated as a word for the things that happen at the events. And it's a real shame, because it means that the most important part of the experience from the attendee's point of view is the last bit that people think about, because they come up with a framework for an event and they book a venue and they arrange speakers and they sort out the catering and get the entertainment sorted, handle all the travel and logistics. And then they go, right, now how are we going to fill the 2 days that we've booked here? Because that is a content mindset that just says we're going to stand on the edge and tip stuff into it until it's full. And part of the problem is the internet, particularly the last 20 years, the rise of our digital age, has seen the word content proliferate. It's in the music industry, it's in the TV and movie industry, and it's in the news industry. And just as a great example, someone shared this just yesterday, and I had to include it. This is my favorite news story of the last 10 years. This is a story, this made, front page of Mail Online, watch your step. Lauren Goodger narrowly avoids walking into a puddle during a day out in Essex, right? This story was shared nearly 10,000 times. What I find really horrifying about it is it was posted on the 15th of February, 2014 at 2:25. 2.5 hours later, the story was updated. There was more. Something else happened as Lauren avoided stepping in a puddle that required this story to be updated. Of course, I'm being rather glib when I say story, because this is content. This is a website that has to generate stuff to give people things to look at. Nobody cares, nobody loses any sleep, but this is an actual thing that appeared on the UK's most frequented news website. And that happens when you prioritize the generation of content over the telling of stories. It used to be that journalism was a respected career where you told compelling stories that had the power to topple governments, bring down kings and queens, to transform people's lives. Now it's someone off Towie didn't step in a puddle. That's content to me. But as I said, I'm a positive person. So whilst I'm sort of sticking the knife into the word content a little bit here, what I do want to stress is content is actually a really important platform. It's a really important marketing tool. And I don't want to sound like I'm suggesting that people shouldn't be making content. What I am suggesting is that we use this opportunity to reconfigure our understanding of the role of content when it comes to building a brand. I'd like to tell another little story. On the left here, you see Bibendum, who you might recognize as the Michelin Man, a cute little icon. He's probably about 120 years old now. He's had a few facelifts and makeovers in the time. He's now got big, cute eyes he didn't used to have. And on the right-hand side, you've got some haute cuisine, some posh nosh. Most people would understand that the word Michelin is associated with posh food. They might even look at these two pictures and say the connection between the two is this, the Michelin Guide. What they probably can't do is tell you the link between the two. And I think if you were to do a straw poll in the street and ask people about the Michelin Guide, they would simply assume that Michelin is, I don't know, maybe a popular name in France. Maybe there's two separate brands that just happen to have the same name. One makes tires and one does restaurant guides. But if you look at the bottom of the Michelin Guide there, that's definitely the tire company logo. So what on earth does a tire company have to do with fine dining? Here's the answer. When Michelin began to grow as a brand, and we're going way back to the 1920s, 1930s, we were seeing the boom of the automobile industry, as it was called back then. And Michelin were there as the most trusted manufacturer of tires. Now, tires, as you all know, are a consumable product, by which I don't mean that you eat them. I just mean that as you use them, they wear down until they're gone, and then you replace them and you buy new tires. In those days, tires were thick, solid rubber, they were very durable, and they were long lasting. So the business challenge for Michelin was that once people had bought tires and they drove off away from the garage where they were fitted, probably at about 6 miles an hour, they weren't going to be coming back for a long time because those tires were going to last. Excuse me. So what Michelin understood was that in order to grow their business, they needed to grow sales. With a finite number of vehicles, the only way they could grow sales was to get people coming back for more tires. And the only way to get people coming back for more tires was to get them to go out and drive more. And so what they did was they came up with a Michelin guide as a way of showing interesting places that people would enjoy, that they could go and visit in their new automobiles, surreptitiously wearing down their tires. And so before they knew it, they'd need to come back and get those tires replaced. It's a genius piece of marketing. It's a genius piece of audience understanding. And it's a genius piece of content marketing, because this Michelin guide is content marketing. It's the very essence of content marketing, using materials of interest to an audience in order to keep your brand front of mind. But at no point in the Michelin guide does it go, while you're here thinking about where you might like to go for some truffled potatoes, can we talk to you about the tread on your tires? Because nobody cares. Nobody wants to sit down and have a conversation about tires. It's just not interesting. Michelin understand that in the provision of content as a marketing platform, what matters is the thing that your audience is interested in, not trying to make yourself the subject of the conversation. And where a lot of businesses go wrong when they pursue content marketing is they think they've got to come up with 20 different ways of talking about themselves. And if you think about a party where you've ever met someone for the first time, the people who talk about themselves all the time are the really boring ones where you're going, I'm sorry, I have to go to the bathroom right now, and you never come back, or you climb out of the window. It's the same at networking events. If somebody is only interested in telling you about themselves, you automatically switch off, you stop listening. It's not interesting. So as I said, content marketing done right is amazing. And here's a simple formula. I'm screwing up all the sciences here today. I've already talked about the biology of the brain. I'm going to do a little maths equation now. The point is, content is not the villain. Content is simply one of our platforms. So if we take content, but we add to content the essence of narrative, what we end up with is a story. So at this point, I think it's good to just encapsulate the story so far and things that we need to start coaching ourselves out of. So here are 3 simple things to avoid. The first one is telling everyone everything every time. And again, think about networking experiences you've had where somebody feels like they've got 90 seconds and they are going to talk as loud and as fast as they can in the hope that they'll get everything out there. That is not the way to do it. It's not interesting, it's not engaging, and it doesn't trigger any of those 3 M's. It's neither meaningful, memorable, or moving. And well, the one maybe bored is an emotion, but it's not one that we want to stimulate. So we have to allow ourselves to be selective with what we choose to impart anytime we get the opportunity to speak to someone. The second thing is, and again, this goes back to that example of brands that try to emulate what Michelin did, but forget what matters. We cannot expect our audiences to care about things as much as we do. And when I say things, I mean us. So the things that drive us as a business, the things that motivate us as employees of that business, matter to us because we're in that business. To the rest of the world, we're just another business. And I mentioned earlier that one of the things that can help to identify where that point of uniqueness or differentiation might sit comes through things like the vision, the mission, the values. Where a lot of businesses go wrong, and I've experienced this firsthand painfully too many times, is they assume that their values, for instance, would be of interest to anyone outside of that business. But the problem is everyone's got values. And if I'm completely honest, having worked on values projects for clients, I'd say a lot of the values are kind of the same. So they're not really allowing you to make any real selective decision about preferred partners or people that you want to work with, because it all becomes a soup of sameness. But that idea that you've got the opportunity to talk and all you really want to do is talk about what matters to you, your audience is going, okay, at what point are we going to turn this around and make it about me? Because we're all motivated by that selfish desire to feel important, to feel wanted, to feel like we're being wooed on an emotional level. And finally, assuming that one size fits all, one of the things that is a real challenge for people when they think about transforming their story, rebuilding their brand, is that it creates a one size fits all piece of communication. And actually, that's not it. If you think back to what I was saying earlier about the power of storytelling for the parent reading a story to a child, what they do when they're reading that same fricking book for the 150th time is they start adding character voices. They start changing the pace of how they deliver the story, maybe skipping over the boring bit that they know the child isn't interested in and they certainly don't want to read it out again. They change the motivations of some of the characters because it's their choice. They're the ones who can read, so the child's not going to know, and they're going to experience the fact that the story was different this time around. So the key to being a storyteller is knowing the tenets of your story effectively enough to be able to tell it differently each time. And there's an interesting side effect of telling it differently each time, which is that you enjoy it more as well. So your passion comes out because each time you're telling it, it's like you're telling it for the first time rather than the 100th time. And there's something else about the process as well. I don't know how many of you are familiar with kintsugi. It's a Japanese cultural phenomenon. It was actually created, I researched this, I think in the 1400s. And basically the Emperor of Japan had a favorite tea bowl. And this tea bowl rolled off a table and broke. And he was distraught because it gave him comfort and familiarity and a sense of control. And it was his favorite heirloom. And what they did was they restored it with a bonding resin, but they blew gold dust into it as they bonded it together. And out of this was born kintsugi, which literally means bonded with gold. And the fascinating thing about kintsugi is as a philosophical practice, it's often used by coaches and therapists as a way of saying we are not less valuable by virtue of being broken. We're actually more valuable and more beautiful because you can see all of our flaws, which is fine as a psychological mindset. And I wholeheartedly encourage everyone to embrace that. But from a storytelling perspective, this is about the idea that it's very hard to start with a blank piece of paper. It's fine if you're a novelist because you're used to that experience of starting with an empty page and just writing a story. But to everyone else, we've already got all of these conflicting messages and background, and we did some mission work and we got some values and we got some employee testimonials and some customer testimonials. And all of these things are vying for our attention when it comes to telling the story. What we need to do is embrace the principle of kintsugi, which is if we break all those pieces apart, we can bond them back together. And the act of bonding them with gold recognizes that it's in the piecing it back together that we add beauty and value to it. So we end up with something that is fundamentally more valuable by virtue of being broken apart and then lovingly restored. And that's how we approach storytelling with everyone that we work with. And just to give you an idea of what that looks like, there are all sorts of different things we think about in terms of how we go about pulling apart everything that people know about their business and bonding it back together. There are 6 core exercises here, but again, I said at the start that I didn't want to make this a presentation about what we do as a business. I simply want to demonstrate that the story I'm telling today clicks very clearly with our process as a business. So you can see here, this is an outlined process from beginning to end. It begins by thinking about audience, and it ends up with a real deep dive into the fundamentals of age-old storytelling practice by looking at the hero's journey and how all archetypal myths and legends are structured around the same basic storytelling tenets. But rather than give you a breakdown of how all that works, what I'd like to do instead is give you 6 simple rules for effective communication, i.e. storytelling. So the first one is simple. I said this earlier as well, thinking about your business from the audience's point of view. And it's such an easy mistake to make. As I said, assuming that everyone cares about things as much as you do is the critical error that too many people make. But sometimes the act of standing on the outside and looking in will also change your own perspective of what your business is about. Thinking about how it looks from the outside, how it feels to be worked with, rather than the things that you expect to tell people about it. And you can run this through an, excuse me, an emotional level. You can think about the difference between perception and knowledge. And you can also think about behavior change drivers. You can think about the change in action that you want people to take. It's a way of making sure that there's always a purpose driving your story forwards. The next thing is that word purpose again. You've got to find the purpose that drives you. And, you know, we often mention the Simon Sinek video, which I imagine most of you have seen on at least one occasion, where he talks about his principle of the golden circle and the why, how, and what. Everyone's seen it. Everyone's embraced that notion that you need a why. Here's the problem. It's easier said than done. Everybody knows that they need a why, but the simple act of coming up with one often ends up just generating a whole bunch of what statements. And the why, we have to allow ourselves permission to go a little bit deeper. I referenced the analogy to coaching and therapy earlier, and this is something that's really true about finding the story at the heart of your business. It is a little bit like lying out on the couch and delving a little bit deeper into the things that drive you, especially when you're an SME, because you are often the business. You're the soul, you're the brain, you're the heart of the business. So the things that drive you as a human being are also the things that are driving the shape and form of your business. That's not to say that this is about standing up and running through your whole biography, because again, that's going back to that issue of assuming that everyone's going to care about the same things that you care about. But if you find a way of forging that human connection by going, this is what drives me as a person, it allows people to get in line behind it. The third thing, and again, this feels almost counterintuitive for someone who's a communications professional to say that there's something as important as words, but behaviors are really fundamental. Again, remember that slide about the vision, the mission, the values, and the attitude. The behavior, the actions that you take, the way you work with people is just as important as what you say about what you do. If you think about the notion that a brand is a promise, the way you behave is how you go about keeping that promise. And back to that point again about how you find a space that allows you to differentiate yourself in an authentic and meaningful way. It's not what you do, it's how you do it. It's the skills and perspectives and talent that you bring to bear that will often start to create a sense that you've got a differentiated space. It's also important to make people feel part of something bigger. You know, we've seen with things like the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter that there are fundamental human drivers that forge a connection between people who are, you know, 5,000 miles apart, a higher purpose that calls them, that helps them see and envision a better world that they want to be a part of. And this is why manifestos are so important to what we do. as businesses and individuals, because they say we're on a journey somewhere and we invite people to come along on that journey with us. And not everyone will. And I think this is one of the points that people sometimes miss, which is we're not here to appeal to everybody. We're here to appeal to the people who will resonate with what we're doing and where we're going, and they'll want to come on this journey with us. So we have to talk about ourselves as if we're creating a movement that people can get on board with. But of course, that's some big, broad thinking. And what we also have to be able to do is distill it right down. And this is where the elevator pitch is so important. I'm sure you've all had opportunities to work on your elevator pitches and think, how do I sum up my business in a couple of lines? I've met a number of people and, very experienced professionals over the years who seem to think that the key to an elevator pitch is speaking as fast as you can to see how many words you can get out before the elevator doors open. So you might only have 20 seconds, but you might be able to get through about 300 words before it goes. That's not an elevator pitch, because that's not allowing somebody to identify the bit that really resonates. So giving yourself the time and energy to sift through everything that you've created, finding the bits that really pop, the bits that trigger an emotion, create a memory, and resonate with your audience is key to developing an elevator pitch. And here's the important bit. The elevator pitch is not the sum total of someone's experience with you. Its only job is to get them to want to find out more. So the idea of distilling it down is not chopping out a bunch of important stuff. It's holding that off for chapter 2 of an ongoing relationship. This is like the teaser ahead of the main feature, where you just show them enough to want to pick up the phone or jump on a Zoom call and get to the next stage of that conversation. And then finally, and this applies to everything you're doing, whether you're engaging with a supplier, you're briefing a creative agency to design a logo, whether you're coming up with a marketing campaign, or whether you're pitching for investment. You are not planning a presentation. And I implore you, as professionals, as experts in your respective fields, to stop thinking about business communication as planning another presentation or writing a proposal. Because every time you get the opportunity to communicate about what you do, you are telling a story. And as long as you embrace the principles of good storytelling, a lot of what we've covered in today's session, you will ensure that you're getting a different kind of a response from them, rather than, well, all the boxes were ticked and you certainly said the information we're expecting to hear. So we've really got 3 final thoughts now, just to sort of encapsulate everything. How are we doing for time? Are we all right? Thumbs up? Yeah, good. So first one, be sure to engage the emotions. And if that's something that feels unfamiliar, then great, because that means we've got a little breakthrough moment here. Thinking about the emotions that we want to stimulate, the responses that will come off the back of that, starts to put us in an interesting new space when it comes to building relationships. Second thing, understanding your purpose. As I said, it's easier said than done. It's a very simple, pithy proposition to say, yes, we've got a purpose. We understand where we're going. We know what our why is. But ask yourself if it's a real why, or if it's just a statement that you've put next to why on a PowerPoint slide. Because if it's not communicating the essence that drives you, the reason you get out of bed in the morning, it's not really a purpose, it's just a thing. And finally, keep your audience in mind at all times. Telling a story is not an opportunity for you to hear the sound of your voice. It's an opportunity for you to see yourself reflected back in the eyes of your audience. It's an opportunity to see them responding to the stimuli that are coming out as you tell your story. The moments of joy, the fear or the anxiety about what the future might hold if they don't partner with you. And the more you build your story around what the audience needs, the more effective that relationship will be. That concludes the presentation for today. So I'd like to now go to the chat function and see what came up during there, if there were any questions that we can address. And I'll let the group control that.
Thank you very much, Gareth. So much really valuable information. I could see people furiously scribbling away going, how can I write all of this down? Loads of nodding, lots of interaction in the chat, lots of people saying this is brilliant. So firstly, a massive thank you, some really great key info. We've had loads of responses to your 3 questions. What do you mean to your customers? What makes you memorable to others? And what emotion do you inspire in people? There's lots of responses in there. Things like trust and reliability, children and bikes, and fun question. I'm seeing a trend of lots of trusted, helpful, knowledgeable, reliable. Terry, I'm sure you're seeing the same. That's a real theme coming through. Valued relationship, excellent service. I think those are the kind of key trends that we're seeing coming through.
Yeah. One of the interesting things to pick up on there about trust, and I was having this conversation the other day with someone because they talked about themselves as a business in the financial sector that rely on trust as a primary business driver when it comes to differentiating themselves from their competition. And the challenge that I fed back to them was, trust is not for you to bestow. Trust is for your prospective client to give to you once it's earned. And so whilst trust is absolutely a fundamental part of the story of your relationship with your clients and prospects, the opportunity for you is to determine how you tell the story of earning that trust and allow the trust to be the reward that comes back to you as a consequence. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it requires a little bit more effort on our part to think about how we go about instilling that sense of trust and talking about why trust is important to us. So for instance, there's certainly an interesting opportunity to talk about trust being a value driver for you, talking about case studies of where you've been able to earn the trust of your customers, and whether it's, you know, not taking a commission or a different kind of commission, or whether it's about how you go about formulating a relationship, how much time you invest in getting to know them before the first bill arrives, all of those things. As I said, trust is in no way a bad thing to talk about, but we need to be mindful of which part of the trust equation we get to own as providers.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree with that, Gareth. Question come through here. Are there any key must avoid areas to disrupt the narrative transportation we are trying to achieve in the storytelling process?
I would say, so at the risk of batting that back, I think one of the challenges in there is that's kind of a complicated sounding question. And it's a great example of how we tend to formulate our points of view to demonstrate how much we know or understand about the world. But what it doesn't necessarily do is cut to a simple point, if that makes sense. So, you know, there's a separate kind of line of training and development that we often work with clients on around setting themselves free from complicated language, because often it can get in the way of the clarity and the understanding that we want to achieve with our customers. I think what I take from that question on its most simple terms is, what are the things to avoid? And I think those were, you know, 3 of the key mistakes that I identified partway through the presentation around assuming that everyone is going to care about the same things you do. My main thing is I try not to be peremptory in the way I work with clients. So it's not about a bunch of do's and don'ts, because I think that often feels too limiting for people. I think the opportunity that we all have when it comes to storytelling in order to build brands and businesses is thinking about, how can I be the most authentic version of myself? Because ultimately, one thing that we all know, categorical fact, is that people don't buy detail, people buy people. And so it doesn't matter what you're saying. Somebody who's evaluating whether or not they want to work with you is making one simple decision. Am I getting a good vibe off this person? Am I liking them? Am I thinking, if I'm going to be working with them for the next 6 months, for instance, am I going to enjoy that experience? Or am I going to find it torturous or difficult or complicated or frustrating? Those are the criteria that they're actually judging you on. And for me, my whole approach and our whole business is all around storytelling, because I know that the one thing that I can say without question is I love telling stories. So people will never feel like I'm phoning in or reading off a script or just saying the same thing that I say every time. I use the same basic slide presentations or key components of those slide presentations, but the way I stitch it together to answer specific questions will always be different, because I just like telling stories. And that enthusiasm can be infectious for other people.
He said it sounds like his business partner telling him not to overthink questions, and rephrase, how do we avoid losing connection on the story journey?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
How do we avoid losing connection on the story journey? I think, does anyone remember? So this is me showing my age now. In the 1980s, which I imagine 2/3 of this audience are probably too young to even remember, there was a really popular trend of choose your own adventure. And these were storybooks that you could buy for like $2.99 in W.H. Smith's. And they tended to be fantastical adventures, and they were aimed at kids from like, I don't know, 10 to 15 years old. And in the days before interactivity, I've seen someone just said they love those.
Yeah, everybody loves them. Getting lots of nods.
Well, the great thing about them was, in an age before interactivity was even a word that we used, it was an opportunity to take part in the crafting of the story. So to reflect back on that question about how do we avoid losing the connection, I think we have to find ways of bringing, I keep saying our audience, I'm mindful that they're customers and clients and prospects. We've got to bring them into the storytelling process. We've got to give them an opportunity to almost define which parts of the story they want to hear about. And I think, this isn't just on a grand scale in terms of how do we transform our website. I think it's more fundamental than that. It's thinking about how we even approach networking opportunities. When we have an opportunity to talk to somebody that we've not met before, do we jump straight in and talk for 5 minutes about ourselves in the hope that they'll hear something interesting? Or do we let them lead the conversation? Because this is how Terry and I tend to do it. We let them lead the conversation until we've got an interesting point of view on something that we've said, not as a segue to make the topic of conversation us, but to go, as a business, we're all about listening and building on what we hear. So we're just going to demonstrate that in the way we let you control your story, and we just build and supplement.
Nice.
And I think that's how you avoid losing that connection is, like the parent and child, you let them dictate part of what they want to take out of the story.
Great. Thank you. Great advice. From Danielle, how do you know when you are doing it or it's working? What are the markers you should look at or measure?
So mine is a very simple personal marker, which is, it's usually face-to-face, even if it's by Zoom. So I can see if people are interested. I can see if they're distracted. I can see if they're sort of doing something else at the same time. And that's usually a sign that it's not a story that's resonating with them. It's not clicking. I didn't say that to make you all suddenly stare intently at the screen either. But those of you that I can see. But the idea there is, as a storyteller, your joy comes from seeing that you're saying something that's clicking with the other person. I sometimes talk about the fact that years ago, I was invited to fly out to Germany to support one of my network's other agencies in a pitch. And I had to do the thing which anyone in an agency role dreads, which is pitching somebody else's work. It's literally the worst thing in the world, because it's not your stuff. And if the client doesn't like it, you've got to feign the fact that it's hurting your feelings, when in actual fact, it wasn't yours. But the challenge was, I had to stand up and do probably 45 minutes of this presentation, because most of the presentation was creative. And I was picked because all of the pitch was taking place in English. The agency was from Sweden and the clients were all German. So it was all taking place in everybody else's second language. And they thought that the best way to present the creative was to have a native English speaker. As I was presenting, I was very mindful that at the very beginning of the pitch, there were 20 clients in the room and there was one seat in the middle that was left empty. And 30 seconds before we were due to start, this woman swept into the room. It was like a proper Cruella de Vil entrance. The crowds parted and she took her seat in the middle of the room without saying a word to anyone. And obviously, you know, I didn't need to be the quickest study in the room to know that she was the boss. But as I stood up and presented, and I crafted a story out of what I'd been asked to present, I used 80% of my presentation energy, all of my gestury hands and eye contact. I used 80% of it to focus on her. And every time I felt like my energy levels were starting to dip, like in a computer game where you've got the little thermometer that shows how much energy you've got, you need to replenish it. Every time I felt like I needed some encouragement, I looked to the PA who'd let us into the room, who was sitting there on the back row going, like, giving me encouragement, everything that I needed. Yeah, this is good. This is not terrible, because I wasn't getting much back from the boss. So I needed to find some positivity elsewhere that I could channel up through and restore my energy levels. And each time then I could focus the energy back on her. And I'm really glad I did, because about halfway through my slot, she was doing this. And then she suddenly went. And I took a gamble and I said, excuse me, I'm sorry to do this, but I'm really conscious that somewhere in the last minute, I just said something that lost you. There is something in the room now that you disagree with. And if I don't course correct now, I could lose you forever. So I'd like to invite you to feedback on the thing that I just said that didn't click with your experience, and address it before we move on. Because if I don't, everything else I say from here on in could be wrong.
Gosh, that was brave. How did it go?
I was brave because it wasn't my client. It wasn't my job. I was
you didn't just get the presentation, rip it up and go, oh, I'm out anyway.
I'll be at the airport. Yeah, no, it wasn't like that. What was interesting was she was clearly taken aback in a good way, because ordinarily when people are in presentation mode, they're just thinking, I need to get through this. I just need to finish my slot so I can sit down and someone else can take on the pressure. Because here's the interesting thing about presenting. 80% of people suffer from glossophobia, which is the fear of public speaking. That means that anytime you are up in front of a bunch of people, 80% of the people in the room are thinking one thing and one thing only, and that's, I'm glad it's not me. So they do not want you to fail, because that will answer all of their fears about public speaking. They want you to do well. So they're really all like that PA who's going like that, because they're thinking, God, I'd be terrified if that was me. So if you can channel all of that energy and demonstrate to the person you're telling the story to that you're responding to the visual cues they're giving you. She didn't shake her head involuntarily. She was communicating to me, that doesn't work. And it takes a confident storyteller to be able to press pause, address the point, then come back and continue the story, and possibly adjust the story as you go. You know, the visual analogy I talk about all the time is from Wallace and Gromit, when Gromit's on the front of the train and he's frantically laying the track as he's weaving in and out of the dining table. It's like that. Sometimes you've got to be able to build your story on the fly, but the better you understand all of those building blocks of the story, the more effectively you can reconfigure it in the moment.
Great. That leads us nicely into the next question that I wanted to ask, and I'll echo that. You know, I've often been told when presenting, just focus on the one person engaged, because one, that will lift your energy and you'll have a better experience at the end of it. Otherwise you'll walk away going, oh, well, that guy at the back wasn't even listening, and oh, well, that was rubbish, you know, but actually you forgot that there was 10 other people in the room having a great time. So the next question is, should you have one story and have it really nailed, or should you have different takes or lenses on the same story depending on who your audience is?
I just seen that come up in the chat thing. That was Craig's question. I'm really glad you picked on that one to ask, because I think it's a really fundamental question. And I think it's sort of a leading question. I think Craig knows the right answer, which is you should always be able to flex and adapt your story. When I talk about having the story nailed, what I mean is the building blocks of the story. It's kind of like a box of Lego, right? You know what the Lego pieces are supposed to look like when you follow the instructions. But storytelling, as I said right at the beginning of my presentation, is about forging a connection with people. So if you can find a way of adapting, changing, shifting parts of the story, leaving out the bit that you don't think is going to be relevant, or focusing more on the bit that you think is going to be relevant, two things happen. One, you tell a story that's more interesting to you because it's not the exact same one that you told the last time you did it. But secondly, your audience, your customer, your prospect will feel that you're understanding what they need to get out of your story. And that's the most important thing of all, because as I said, storytelling is building connections. It's not standing up and talking about yourself.
Great. Thanks. I'm one of the 20%, so I don't mind standing up and talking about myself. But okay, a technical question here. So how important is a blog in storytelling? Is this the kind of platform to use to talk about around the business without directly speaking about it all the time? So what do we think of blogs, tools, platforms? How can we storytell without storytelling?
I'm a big fan of blogs. I think blogs are a really vital way of communicating human to human rather than business to business. I used to write a blog for years that wasn't related to my business life. It was all about pop culture. And the interesting thing is, as somebody who had spent probably, I think when I started the blog, I'd been working for about 15 years. In all of those 15 years, I'd been communicating on other people's behalves. I've been writing for brands and businesses. I'd been writing, speeches and presentations for CEOs and VPs and things. So as good as I was at writing, I was never writing for me. And the hardest thing I had to learn when I started writing a blog was learning to speak with my voice, because I hadn't ever taken any time to think about what my voice was. I didn't know what my point of view was. I didn't know whether I was funny. I didn't know whether people would even care about what my point of view was on things. And so even as a professional writer, it took some practice to be comfortable with having that voice. And I say all of that by way of answering the question, because if you write a blog for your business, you really have two things to consider. One is, how much of your voice will you allow yourself to have? And secondly, it's the one that goes back to that point I made earlier when I was talking about the Michelin guide. Your clients will not follow or read your blog if it's just a bunch of iterative versions of you talking about yourself. If your story exists and it's the thing that drives you, then you could find 10 or 15 different points of view on how you see the world that will always fuel what would make for a great blog post. So you need never connect it back to the service or product that you sell, but your point of view is authentic and relevant because of the space that you occupy as a business. But what you do is you make sure that when people come to the blog, they're not coming to read ads. There's a reason, TiVo and Netflix and all of those technology solutions were so popular, because it meant we can watch TVs, the stories that we enjoy, without ads. So the moment you write a blog that someone spends their time reading and you go, oh, actually, I'm just going to stick in a reference to what we do as a business, you kill that relationship that you've spent all of that time and effort trying to build, because you're turning it back into a horrible word that proliferated in the 1980s, the advertorial, where it sort of felt a bit like a magazine editorial, but it was also really an ad. Or if you've ever watched those 30-minute infomercials on some of the cable channels where they can talk for 30 minutes about a rotisserie oven, it's amazing. But you know that it's all rubbish because it's just designed to keep talking about the product until your resolve is worn down. Blogs are great for point of view and for allowing your personality as a business to really come across.
Yeah, I think about showing a bit of your personal brand and your own personal values. I love
Absolutely.
reading a blog. So great. Let me just have a look, see if we've got any more questions before we wrap up. Well, that's quite a long one. When marketing, for example, on a website, there is a standard value proposition and other information which reflects the company's views and values. How do we make marketing materials as engaging and as possible to relate to people, given it's hard to have a lot of versions? It's quite a long one.
Yeah, so how do we make I think that's the thing, is when you position something on a forum like your corporate website, you don't get the chance to come up with 100 different iterations. It is what it is. I think what you should prioritize is not allowing that, value proposition to become the lead of the story. The point for me is the value proposition is, if you want to know the basics and you've only got 2 minutes to research us as a business, take a look at this and this will give you the nutshell. But no one will make a decision to work with you based on the nutshell. What they might do is they'll make a decision to include you in a list of potential vendors, because they'll go, we can see that you've got a basic competency and there's some similar matching in terms of what we're looking to get out of a relationship with a provider. But that's not storytelling. It's just corporate bare minimum. So I think all the other opportunities, whether it's the networking, it's the social media, it's the face-to-face, it's the meetings, it's the pitches, it's the supplier negotiations. Those are the bits where you get the opportunity to tell a fresh, coherent story each time. I'm conscious we've got a raised hand here as well from Laura.
Laura.
Hi, I want to ask a question, please. If you are telling your story and you're telling it to somebody that is holding like a polar opposite values and like things that are important to them, do you would you tailor your story towards things that are important to them, or would you tell your story more convincingly to hopefully get them onto your side, or a bit of both?
Good question.
I love that. I love that question, Laura, because it's a real doozy. And I think what's interesting about it is there's a clear parallel to how we are as human beings. So if you think about when you meet someone at a party or at a dinner or with friends, and you instantly sense that they've got a completely different worldview to you, you can decide how much energy you want to expend on trying to convince them that you're the same, or trying to bend their will to the way you see the world. I think both of them require quite a lot of effort. And fundamentally, there will be a point where if their worldview is so diametrically opposed to yours, even if you were to get them convinced that they could work with you, you might not necessarily want that relationship. So I think the key takeout here is, by all means, adapt your story to make sure that it reflects the priorities of your audience, but don't assume that you always have to appeal to everybody. Part of storytelling is about, like I keep saying, it's about forging a connection. And sometimes you'll recognize that the connection simply isn't there. And it's just as positive and fruitful for your mental well-being as it is for the future of your business to be able to go, this probably isn't going to be right for us. So I'm really glad that you brought your provocative point of view and asked me that challenging question about something that I fundamentally disagree with. This probably isn't going to be right for us, but I wish you luck in finding a provider that will probably share a similar worldview, because you'll find them easier to work with. And then that way you've been mature, you've been responsive, you've been adaptable, but you also haven't had to sacrifice the things that you hold dear.
Great answer. And good for all walks of life, I think, all walks of life. So I think that nicely wraps us up for this afternoon. Before you all leave the call, if you could just hold on, because I'm going to ask you to give us some feedback. I've got a QR code for you to scan, so I'd really appreciate you just hanging on for a couple of minutes to do that for us. Gareth, Terry, thank you. That was absolutely brilliant. The thanks are flooding in already. Heaps of useful information, some great tangible activities for you all, the audience, to all go away with. So go away and think about those 3 questions that you were posed. There were some brilliant answers in the chat, but I think that's something that you should really go away and work with and consider those questions. I've even written down some for myself, for my own personal brand. So I think please do that. Go away and think about how you can apply what you've just heard about in your own businesses. That's the key to the value of these events, is that actually going away and taking some action from what you've heard today. So I would encourage you to go and do that. Talk about what you've heard in your next coaching session if you're one of our accelerator members. do your research, and yeah, put some time in your diary to actually go away and think about the things you've heard and listened to today to bring them to life in your own businesses. Like I said, I'm going to circulate some contact details, but I'm sure we've all got the internet, so we can Google Inside Stories if you'd like to contact either Gareth or Terry. And yeah, a massive thank you again for your time today. Really engaging, really interesting session.
Now you know why Gareth does the presenting.
Oh, I'm sure you'd have been just as great, Terry. I don't know what you're talking about.
I got two of these, you see, I listen. When I do say something, it's insightful and challenging.
Yeah, there you go. I can see that you're the silent challenger of the duo.
Absolutely.
Right, so I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Firstly, I'd like to just mention our partners Hiscox. This sounds like an ad, but our partners Hiscox, if you haven't got business or indemnity insurance, I would encourage you to research that and reach out to Hiscox. There's a direct email box there that you can contact them with. And lastly, your feedback is really important to us. As you know, that we run regular events. So I'd really appreciate you just taking a couple of minutes of your time to provide feedback on the event that you've been to today. Terry and Gareth, the presentation, me, we're looking for feedback on those. So please do take some time to scan that QR code or go to the link and provide some feedback. We would really appreciate it. So I'm just going to hang on here for a couple of minutes to allow you to do so. And Eve, if you want to just stop the recording, that would be fabulous. Thank you very much.